Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue to work my way through N.T. Wright's Simply Christian from my atheist perspective. In this video I'm going to cover chapters 7 and 8 of Simply Christian. So let's get started with a look at chapter 7, which is titled Jesus and the Coming of God's Kingdom. And I'll open with a quote from Wright. He says at the very beginning of the chapter, quote, "Christianity is about something that happened to Jesus of Nazareth, something that happened through Jesus of Nazareth." I would only quibble that until there is evidence presented substantiating the claims made about Jesus by the Gospels and accepted by Christians like N.T. Wright, it's actually more honest to say Christianity is about something that supposedly happened to and through Jesus of Nazareth, because there is not broad agreement about what happened to and through Jesus, or in fact, if anything happened to and through Jesus, particularly among people outside of the Christian church and holding something other than the Christian worldview. Christianity, Wright goes on, is not about Jesus bringing us new moral principles. It's not that the life and message of Jesus didn't include important moral teachings. It's that the moral teachings were not Jesus' main purpose. Neither is Christianity about Jesus providing a new way for people to go to heaven, Wright says. Quote, "This is a persistent mistake based on the medieval notion that the point of all religion, the rule of the game if you like, was to make sure you ended up at the right side of the stage at the end of the mystery play. That is, in heaven rather than in hell. Again, that isn't to deny that our present beliefs and actions have lasting consequences. Rather, it's to deny both that Jesus made this the focus of his work and that this is the point of Christianity. Christianity isn't about delivering fresh teachings about God either. Again, learning more about who God is through Jesus is very important, but that still isn't the point. So, what is the point of Christianity?" Wright says, quote, "Christianity is all about the belief that the living God, in fulfillment of his promises and as the climax of the story of Israel, has accomplished all this, the finding, the saving, the giving of new life in Jesus. In particular, we are all invited, summoned actually, to discover through following Jesus that this new world is indeed a place of justice, spirituality, relationship, and beauty, and that we are not only to enjoy it as such, but to work at bringing it to birth on earth as is in heaven. In listening to Jesus, we discover whose voice it is that has echoed around the hearts and minds of the human race all along." This would be, I think, another example of what I have termed in previous An Atheist Read series, Christian happy talk. There's a lot of gushing about how awesome Jesus is, about how we can know him and experience a new world through him, and how we are called to share his love and to follow his example and bring forth a new world in his name. But if you aren't a Christian already and primed by years of absorbing similar rhetoric to smile and nod along with what Wright is saying, this just sounds like a bunch of gibberish. Wright asks the question, what is Christianity about? He then rejects three specific possible answers: that it's about moral teachings, that it's about saving the dead from an eternity in hell, that it's about sharing the truth about God with others. And instead, he offers a lot of vague, smilingly delivered Christianese about how those echoing voices that we all hear really are, as I said in an earlier episode, just Jesus whispering to our hearts. So anyway, Christianity is all about understanding and sharing how awesome Jesus is. But how do we really know what Jesus is like? What do we really know about Jesus? Wright acknowledges that despite how much is written about him, even to this day, ongoing, we have far less information about the life of Jesus than we do about the life of more recent historical figures like Winston Churchill or John F. Kennedy. And I would add, although Wright doesn't mention this, we also have far less information about Jesus than we do about other more historically prominent figures from Jesus' own era than we do about Jesus. But even so, we know more about Jesus than we do about many other ancient figures, including, Wright cites as an example, Tiberius, who was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' death. Still, there are gaps in our knowledge about Jesus. Not only is there the well-known silence of the Gospels regarding the early life of Jesus, there are also many details missing about the everyday life of Jesus, including details as basic as what he looked like. And these missing details keep us from reconstructing a more complete picture of the historical Jesus. And I would hasten to add that even much of what a Christian like Wright would consider our reliable knowledge about Jesus should be considered suspect. The only reason he can really say that we know more about Jesus than we know about Emperor Tiberius is because Wright is counting the Gospels as reliable sources of biographical information about Jesus. Really, if you put those under suspicion and you read them skeptically and critically and you don't just accept them as reliable sources, you can't really say that we know more about Jesus than we know about someone like Tiberius, who was a Roman emperor who we at least can be fairly sure actually existed. Now, having said that, I'm not a proponent of the Christ myth theory. I think that there probably was a historical Jesus, or at least a historical figure that served as the basis for the Jesus that we read about in the Gospels. And I don't even think that it's necessarily fair or reasonable to just reject every single word written about Jesus in the Gospels out of hand. I think it should be examined critically. I do think we should be extremely skeptical about the New Testament as a source for information about Jesus. And obviously, as I've mentioned many, many times before, much of that skepticism is compelled by the fact that the Gospels contain accounts of miracles and angels and other fantastic details. But even without the supernatural elements, I think it would only make sense to be very wary of the New Testament as a source for Jesus. After all, would you trust a biography published by the Church of Scientology as a source for reliable information about L. Ron Hubbard? Anyway, Wright acknowledges that there are gaps in our knowledge about Jesus, and he suggests that the best way to sort of fill in these gaps and come to a fuller understanding of Jesus is to try and understand him in the context of the world in which he lived, which would be the first century Middle East. But even there, even with that added information about the context of Jesus, it's not that simple. Attempts to understand Jesus are complicated even further by the beliefs that Christians hold about him, namely the belief that though Jesus is no longer alive in a physical sense, he is with us in some way, and he is able for us to know him. Wright says that Jesus himself, in person, is that point that he's mentioned before where God's space and our space intersect. As it was once believed about the temple in Jerusalem, Christians believe that in Jesus, both during his earthly life prior to his crucifixion and right now, this very moment, heaven and earth come together. Jesus is the nexus that links our world and God's world. And Jesus is present in both heaven and earth. Wright says, quote, "For anyone who believes this and tries to live by it, writing the history of Jesus is far more complicated than simply documenting the life of a figure from the past. It is more like writing the biography of a friend who is still very much alive and still liable to surprise us." The key phrase there is, "for anyone who believes this." For someone like me who doesn't believe it, the beliefs that Christians hold about Jesus and how those beliefs complicate the process of understanding Jesus are utterly irrelevant. I could not care less how the beliefs of Christians complicate their ability to reconstruct a historical Jesus, because I lack those beliefs. I see no reason to hold those beliefs. They mean nothing to me. unless I have a reason to hold those beliefs, unless I have a reason to think that Jesus is both a figure from history and a living, present spirit that I can have a real relationship with, my task of learning about Jesus and Jesus' life is no different than learning about the life of Alexander the Great, or Confucius, or Julius Caesar, or Qin Shi Huang, or any other figure from the ancient past whose name we still remember, about whom we might like to know something, but it's a complicated task because we are separated by so many years of history from this person. Wright began the chapter by saying that Christianity is about something that happened. It's very important. Christianity claims to be a historical faith, a faith that is rooted in actual events. And Wright is correct in insisting that that history must be considered by Christians when forming their understanding of who Jesus was. Wright criticizes the practice that some Christians favor of just sort of ignoring the historical Jesus completely and just writing about Jesus purely in the present tense. Jesus as they believe he is with them. Jesus active in the church today. Wright says you can't do that. You must reckon with the historical Jesus as well, because it's all the same thing and one is based on the other. But he, like the other apologists that I've read, begins that examination of history with his religious beliefs about Jesus and the authority of the Bible already in place. When I consider the Bible and Jesus without Christian presuppositions, I see absolutely nothing to substantiate any of what Wright has written about Jesus, the divine, eternal, ever-present Son of God. The only supposed sources for Jesus of any significance that even claim to offer us any real detail about the man's life, and the only ones that Christians accept and have to rely on, are the four canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But now the question Wright asks us rhetorically is, can we trust these Gospels? First, Wright rejects the notion that non-canonical Gospels, and here he singles out the Gospel of Thomas, should be considered equal to the four traditional canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas in particular is too recent. Wright reckons that it's 2nd century, and depicts a Jesus that is not only contrary to the Jesus we read about in the Gospels, but also contrary to the 1st century Jewish context in which Jesus would have lived. Now, unlike the Gospel of Thomas and other non-canonical Gospels, the four canonical Gospels aren't merely collections of sayings that are attributed to Jesus. They're narratives. They tell the story of Jesus. Also, unlike the non-canonical Gospels, they were written relatively early. Wright places them at around 90 A.D. by the latest, but he also adds that personally he's inclined to think that they were actually authored even earlier than that. And he says they are based on sources which date back even earlier, to the time when the original followers of Jesus were still alive. In fact, Wright assumes that sources about the life and teachings and exploits of Jesus, both oral and written, must have been plentiful at the time that the four Gospels were being created. He says, quote, "This doesn't mean, of course, that everything the Gospels say is thereby automatically validated. I simply record it as my conviction that the four canonical Gospels, broadly speaking, present a portrait of Jesus of Nazareth which is firmly grounded in real history." I agree. Except for all the stuff that we know they get wrong, and all the other stuff that is too far-fetched to be accepted without additional evidence, I'm sure the Gospels are reasonably reliable historical sources, generally speaking. Wright goes on, quote, "The portrait of Jesus we find in the canonical Gospels makes sense within the world of Palestine in the 20s and 30s of the 1st century. And the portrait of Spider-Man we find in Marvel Comics makes sense within the world of New York City in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That doesn't mean that people living 2,000 years from now should accept those comics as historical sources." So, what did Jesus mean when he told people that the kingdom of God was at hand? This, Wright says, is the key to the belief that the story of Jesus is the climax of the larger story of Israel. When Jesus declared that the kingdom of God was at hand, he was telling people that God was about to fulfill his promises, his long-standing promises dating all the way back to Abraham, the promises to liberate his chosen people from oppression and to judge and punish their enemies, and then to create a new, just, peaceful world where his people would never again be threatened. But unlike earlier calls for Israel to rebel against the empire that ruled over it, Jesus wasn't calling his followers to lead a military revolt against the Romans or to seek political freedom. He was declaring that God was changing everything, fulfilling his promise in a way that nobody had expected. Not by leading a military revolt, but by calling Israel to love and forgive the enemies that had wronged it, and thereby demonstrate the true nature of God to the whole world. Wright describes how some of the details of Jesus' ministry were designed to communicate this radical message to people who weren't quite prepared to receive it. Wright says, quote, "His choice of 12 close followers was a powerful symbol in itself, speaking of the remaking of the whole people of God, the 12 tribes of Israel, descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. That remaking of God's people was at the heart, too, of his remarkable healings. There is no doubt, historically, that he possessed healing powers. That was why he attracted not only crowds, but also accusations of being in league with the devil." Ah! Wait just a second there. Thought you'd sneak that one in on me, didn't you, Tom? There is no doubt historically that Jesus possessed healing powers. You know, you work so hard to set yourself up as a moderate, a more reasonable apologist. You try to strike this very reasonable tone throughout the book to this point, to acknowledge the difficulties involved in reconstructing an accurate picture of the historical Jesus. And then you go and you say something as silly and misleading and just flat out the fuck wrong as there's no doubt historically that Jesus had magical healing powers. I'm not angry. I'm not surprised. I'm just disappointed. First, how do we know Jesus drew crowds? What's the source for Jesus drawing crowds? Second, let's say we accept that Jesus drew crowds. That's not that extraordinary of a claim. Let's just say Jesus drew crowds. Is there no way of explaining that other than that he actually had miraculous healing powers? In the 1920s, Amy Semple McPherson drew crowds numbering in the tens of thousands to witness and participate in her faith healings. Does that mean she actually possessed healing powers? Today, faith healers like Benny Hinn and Reinhard Bonnke and many, many others hold revival meetings with miracle healings in front of even larger crowds all over the world, much larger crowds than Jesus surely ever would have been able to gather. Does that mean they actually have healing powers? And if we reject the notion that McPherson and Hinn and Bonnke and Oral Roberts and Catherine Kuhlman and numerous other faith healers of our more recent history were or are actually able to heal people, despite the massive crowds of true believers they drew and continue to draw today, why should we accept that Jesus did have the ability to miraculously heal people on the basis of a few reports that he drew crowds by doing so, written by anonymous followers of his 2,000 years ago? Wright finishes off the chapter by reiterating that Jesus' message was a challenge not just to Rome, but to the Jewish religious establishment, and an announcement that things were different now. Quote, "So what did Jesus intend by it all? What did he think would happen next? Why did he walk into trouble in this way? And why, after his own violent death, did anyone take him seriously any longer, let alone suppose he was the true living embodiment of the one true God? Well, that's the final paragraph of the chapter, and that is a hook if ever I read one. So let's move right on to chapter 8, Jesus, Rescue and Renewal. It still sounds like the title of a TV movie to me. Jesus, Rescue and Renewal, starring Nancy Travis and Joe Penny. So, when last we saw Jesus, a few seconds ago, at the conclusion of the previous chapter, he had gone to Palestine to tell everyone that God's kingdom was at hand. He told them not just through his words, but through his actions, healing people, shit like that. Then he dropped a bombshell on his disciples. He announced that he would suffer and die, only to rise again on the third day. Now, at first, the disciples probably didn't understand exactly what Jesus was telling them. They interpreted this as another echo of biblical prophecy, another description of the coming kingdom of God. The disciples didn't have this misunderstanding because they were stupid, though, if I could interject, they were stupid, quite stupid. The Gospels make that clear on multiple occasions. No, this time it wasn't the stupidity of the disciples, it was a combination of the fact that Jesus often communicated in parables and riddles rather than just speaking plainly to his obviously slow-witted followers, and of the fact that those same followers saw him as the Messiah, the promised leader of their people, who wasn't supposed to die, but rather to lead Israel to a final and lasting victory over its enemies. Wright says, quote, Jesus appears to have seen it differently, and here we come close to the heart of his own understanding of his vocation. We have already noted with unavoidable Christian hindsight that at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy stood the figure of the suffering servant. Some saw the servant as a Messiah, all right, but the suffering of which Isaiah spoke would be the suffering he would inflict on Israel's enemies. Others saw the servant as one who would suffer, but this meant, inevitably, in their eyes, that he couldn't be the Messiah. Wright proposes that Jesus fused these two interpretations to form his own version, his own view of himself as the suffering servant. He would save the world from sin and bring about God's final victory as the Messiah had been promised to do, but he would accomplish this through his own suffering. If Wright is correct that this was Jesus' interpretation of this passage of Isaiah, it would be somewhat embarrassing for Jesus. Because Jesus left out a third interpretation of the suffering servant, a third possible interpretation, and in fact, it's the most widely held interpretation among Jewish scholars, the most obvious interpretation, and the interpretation which Wright acknowledged in a previous chapter but now seems to have forgotten about, and that is the interpretation that posits the suffering servant not as the Messiah or any other actual person, but as a symbol of Israel. And I say that it's the most obvious interpretation because, as I pointed out in previous series when discussing this passage, and as some of you also pointed out in the comment section of the previous video in this series, that's literally what Isaiah says. It says right there in the text, the suffering servant is Israel. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jesus and his disciples and his other followers come into Jerusalem for one last Passover before, Jesus goes to the temple and surprisingly attacks not the Romans who are oppressing his Jewish people, but the Jewish temple, which he declares to be corrupt. He turns over tables and he prevents normal business that is usually held from being conducted in the temple. He did this, Wright says, as a sign that the temple itself had been judged by God. And as he waited for the authorities to find him and drag him off to be crucified, Jesus had a final Passover meal with his disciples. Wright says, quote, "It was time for the evil which had dogged Jesus' footsteps throughout his career the shrieking maniacs, the conspiring Herodians, the carping Pharisees, the plotting chief priests, the betrayer among his own disciples, the whispering voices within his own soul, to gather into one great tidal wave of evil that would crash with full force over his head. Earlier I mentioned Christian happy talk. Well, here, Wright indulges in another favorite trope of evangelists and apologists, absurdly inflating the significance of events pertaining to Jesus. Jesus sweeps into the temple like he owns the place, which I suppose he kind of thinks that he does, maybe. And he wrecks the joint, and the Jewish authorities, in whose faces Jesus has been pissing for much of his ministry, finally decide they've had enough and they come to get him. Now, right or wrong, whether you agree with his arrest and punishment or not, it was entirely a local matter. The authorities saw Jesus as getting too big for his britches, so they handled him. But instead of a rebel being arrested and punished for making trouble and pissing off the wrong people, Jesus is being crushed by a tidal wave of evil that has been bearing down on him his entire life, because, as a Christian, Wright needs everything pertaining to Jesus to have everlasting cosmic significance. For everybody, whether you're a Christian or not. That's the thing that's so irritating about the habit of Christians overstating things. They assume that even if you're not a Christian, you should think that the events in the life of Jesus are of utmost importance to everybody. They are the most historically significant things that have ever happened anywhere. Jesus is eating Passover meal with his disciples, and he describes the bread as his own body, which he would give on behalf of others, to take the punishment they would otherwise have to bear themselves. Wright says, quote, "His death would do what the temple, with its sacrificial system, had pointed toward but had never actually accomplished. In meeting the fate which was rushing toward him, he would be the place where heaven and earth met, as he hung suspended between the two." I take that as a reference to the crucifixion, Jesus hanging on the cross. I assume Wright is being metaphorical there, since he spent so much effort making the point that heaven is not literally up in the sky, although maybe Jesus thought it was. If you misinterpreted Isaiah, who knows what the fuck else he got wrong. Anyway, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, and if we accept verses in the Gospel of Luke, which were probably later additions to the text, he is also comforted by an angel and starts to sweat blood. Then he's arrested, he's tried by the priests, he's found guilty of blasphemy, and then he's crucified by the Roman authorities on charges of sedition. Wright says, quote, "The death of Jesus of Nazareth as the King of the Jews, the bearer of Israel's destiny, the fulfillment of God's promises to his people of old, is either the most stupid, senseless waste and misunderstanding the world has ever seen, or it is the fulcrum around which world history turns." There's more of that Christian overstatement. Jesus just being a guy who was unjustly executed isn't an option. His death is either the greatest waste in the history of the world or the most pivotal occurrence ever. Notice, even if we reject that Jesus was the Son of God, even if we don't believe that Jesus was anything other than a man, somehow his unjust trial and execution is the greatest, most senseless and stupid waste the world has ever seen. Far greater, for some reason, than the uncounted other people throughout human history who have been unjustly executed. Somehow Jesus is just worse. It just is, whether you think that Jesus was the Son of God or not. So anyway, Jesus dies, and he's resurrected, and here Wright quickly covers a few points that will be familiar to any of you who are somewhat well-read in Christian apologetics or have maybe watched previous series like these that I've done. Christians believe that Jesus was resurrected, not resuscitated. He was really dead, and he really came back to life. They reject the swoon theory. Nor was the belief in the resurrection the product of hallucination or wishful thinking by the disciples. Wright says once Jesus was dead, they had no reason to expect that he would ever come back, except that, according to the Gospels, Jesus had told them that's what was going to happen. Although, As we've also previously pointed out, the disciples were pretty stupid, so maybe they just forgot that Jesus said that. Anyway, Wright says, quote, "No, the best explanation by far for the rise of Christianity is that Jesus really did reappear, not as a battered, bleeding survivor, not as a ghost, the stories are very clear about that, but as a living, bodily human being." Really, the best explanation by far, the best explanation for the growth of a cult founded on the belief that a man returned from the dead is that the man actually returned from the dead. This despite the fact that the only sources reporting this miraculous, unprecedented, world-changing event come from the church itself. Between his resurrection and his ascension, Jesus supposedly appeared to multitudes of people. That, plus the sudden darkness and the earthquake that occurred in Jerusalem and the Jewish saints who, according to Matthew, walked out of their graves and were seen throughout the city following his death on the cross, suggest that his resurrection must have been a sensation, a well-known fact to people in that area of the world in that time, whether they were followers of Jesus or not. And yet we have not one non-Christian source that even claims any such things happened. We have non-Christian sources that refer to what Christians of the time believed had happened, but not a single non-Christian source reporting that yes, in fact, Jesus died and returned from the grave and all the rest of it. Wright insists that an actual resurrection is the best explanation for the rise of the Christian church, but by that same rationale, isn't the best explanation for the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that Joseph Smith actually was a prophet? That the Book of Mormon really was translated from golden plates revealed to Smith by an angel? After all, the Mormons were originally a small, despised group founded by a man with a reputation as a fraud and a con artist. They had to overcome incredible odds to even survive, let alone grow and flourish and attain the acceptance and even influence they now enjoy in the United States and all over the world. The Mormons were just one group of many religious separatist groups that originated in the same area of the United States in the same period of history. And yet they are the one group that held on, that stayed together, that continued to grow and evolve and gain great cultural acceptance. Why were the Mormons the one group that maintained their identity from that period, from that burned over district area and time in history? Why were they the only church that survived and maintained their identity and grew and prospered? Isn't the most likely explanation that their dogmas are true? That the Book of Mormon really is a holy book? That it really was revealed to Joseph Smith by an angel? What other explanation is there? How do you explain how the Mormon Church came so far from such difficult original circumstances if the Book of Mormon and the teachings of Joseph Smith aren't true? I demand an explanation. I demand that if you reject that explanation, if you reject the Mormon Church's official explanation of who Joseph Smith was and where the Book of Mormon came from and how they were able to survive and grow and prosper, if you reject that, I demand that you provide an alternative explanation. Because I submit, under the same logic that N.T. Wright uses for the resurrection, that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints explanation should be considered the default explanation. Right? Isn't that how it works? That's how the resurrection works, apparently. Anyway, Wright is undaunted by the scientific implausibility of the resurrection. He says, quote, "Science, after all, rightly studies phenomena which can be repeated in laboratory conditions. But history doesn't. Historians study things that happened once and once only. Even if there are partial parallels, each historical event is unique, and the historical argument is quite clear. To repeat, far and away the best explanation for why Christianity began after Jesus' violent death is that he really was bodily alive again 3 days later in a transformed body." Well, Wright can repeat that assertion all he wants. Repetition doesn't make it true. Science does study things that can be repeated in a laboratory, but that isn't the only way science works. There is a scientific method that can be applied to a wide variety of investigations, and history, properly practiced, relies on that scientific method and must investigate and weigh explanations and interpretations of historical events to find the most plausible conclusion. Historical events must be interpreted within the context of the universe in which we live, governed by the laws of physics as we understand them. You can't claim that a resurrection could plausibly have occurred without any actual evidence that it did or for how it did, on the basis that, hey, history is full of unique events. That's not the way it works. If you would be skeptical of any extraordinary claim made by someone about something that happened today, you should be even more skeptical about such a claim made about something that supposedly happened thousands of years ago. Would you believe it if somebody told you that a person who had been executed was raised from the dead 3 days later if you heard that it had happened over the weekend? Because if you would be skeptical of that claim, you should be even more skeptical of the claim about the resurrection of Jesus. Wright continues, still on the subject of the resurrection and science. He says, quote, "There are in fact partial parallels to this kind of thing precisely in the world of contemporary science. Scientists now regularly ask us to believe things which seem strange and even illogical, not least in the areas of astrophysics or quantum mechanics. With something as basic as light, for example, they find themselves driven to speak in terms both of waves and of particles, though these appear incompatible. Sometimes, to make sense of the actual evidence before us, we have to pull our worldview, our sense of what's possible, into a new shape. That is the kind of thing demanded by the evidence about Easter." What evidence? This is the question I ask in every episode of this book, every chapter of this book. What evidence? He talks about the evidence for Easter. What is the evidence about Easter? Is he talking about the growth of Christianity, which Wright finds absolutely inexplicable unless the resurrection really happened? That's not evidence. There is no evidence. There is a claim that Jesus returned from the dead, and then there is incredulity about the suggestion that the claim is false. Wright says Jesus must have come back from the dead because if he didn't, well, I can't think of any other way the Christian church could have survived. That's not an explanation. That's incredulity at the possibility that your favorite explanation might not be right. The fact that N.T. Wright and many other Christians can't imagine how Christianity would have grown if the resurrection didn't actually happen doesn't mean the resurrection actually happened. It's evidence for nothing other than their bias and closed-mindedness and lack of imagination. And as for science, it's true. Many of the concepts of modern science seem counterintuitive to us, but unlike the outrageous claims of Christianity, and of all other religions as well, to be fair, scientists have evidence, and I mean they have real evidence, that anyone can examine to compel their belief in these seemingly far-fetched concepts. For instance, the double slit experiment. It demonstrates that light behaves as both a particle and a wave. It demonstrates things about quantum probability, and it is exactly the sort of repeatable experiment Wright was talking about when he was attempting to contrast science with the study of history. It may be a mind-blowing result. You might look at the double slit experiment and think, oh my God, how could that possibly happen? But you can repeat that experiment over and over again. You can have other people, independent of you, repeat that experiment over and over and compare results and come to the conclusion that yes, this must be what is happening. There's the evidence. Now, this is the only logical interpretation of these results. That's how science works. There is evidence that compels a conclusion, even a conclusion that seems counterintuitive. Science asks us to accept things which appear strange and illogical because its method has shown us evidence that the universe is sometimes such a place. Science doesn't ask us to accept these things on faith. It gives us reasons to think that these things are actually true. Well, Wright wraps up the chapter with a consideration of how Jesus regarded his own divinity. He says, quote, "I do not think Jesus knew he was divine in the same way that we know that we are cold or hot, happy or sad, male or female. It was more like the kind of knowledge we associate with vocation, where people know in the very depths of their being what they are called, that they are called to be an artist, a mechanic, a philosopher. For Jesus, this seems to have been a deep knowledge of that kind, a powerful and all-consuming belief that Israel's God was more mysterious than most people had supposed, that within the very being of this God, there was a give and take, a to and fro, a love given and received. Jesus seems to have believed that he, the fully human prophet from Nazareth, was one of those partners in love." Oh, good for Jesus. It's nice to be in love. That sort of deep inner knowing might be fine if we're talking about someone's desire to pursue a particular field of study or to live their life in a certain way. But when it comes to gaining knowledge about reality, knowledge about things like, for instance, whether or not God exists, or whether or not we might be his only begotten Son, science tells us that this sort of deep knowledge is not a reliable source of information. Damn you, science. Why can't we just know things? You know, N.T. Wright and I disagree on a lot of things, and the list keeps getting longer. But one thing we agree on is the quotation marks around that kind of knowledge. Hey, that's it for this video, everybody. I'll be back in the next video in the series to cover the next 2 chapters of this book. Those chapters would be Chapter 9, God's Breath of Life, and Chapter 10, Living by the Spirit. That's for the next episode. We're halfway done this book now. So thank you guys so much for watching. As always, please leave a comment. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm an idiot. Help me make a point you think I could have made better. Whatever you want, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Christian, whatever your personal perspective is, I always look forward to reading your comments. Thanks again for watching. I'm glad that this is of interest and of use to you, and I'll see you next time.